going great, and they're only getting better.
Hey gang, this is Dr. Bain, and this is our unit on Speaking to Inform. It accompanies Chapter 13 of our Zarefsky and Engels textbook. In this unit, we're going to focus on making sure we are clear on the difference between informative and persuasive speaking. What are some strategies to get the most from informative speaking? And how do we design our speeches to increase the chances that the message is remembered? Because, what's the point if people don't remember it, right? So let's get started with some clarification on informing versus persuading. So the relevant one here is obviously to inform. We also had to instruct in our list of 5, and then we also had a list of 6 from Chapter 6 that included these 3 that were particularly relevant today: provide new information or perspective, agenda setting, and creating positive or negative feeling. So those are the ones that are most relevant in what we're doing today. At first blush, informing doesn't seem like it's hard to distinguish from persuading, but take it a step further. Can you really inform people about something without trying to persuade them that it's important? Can you really persuade people without giving them information upon which they make a decision to believe or act in the way you're trying to get them to do? We don't teach you about public speaking without at least once every class convincing you it's important to know this stuff. And if someone was giving you a persuasive speech about giving blood, she wouldn't do that without telling you about the process, which is informing. But we also have entertain. And if you're not at least a little bit entertaining in both cases, you have very little hope of achieving your purpose. So there is some overlap, right? The reason we're focusing on this right now is to try to help you make sure that you don't let these bleed together when and where they shouldn't. So identify your constraints and opportunities that you have with this particular audience and occasion before developing your specific purpose for an informative speech. Remember that these help us get more clear on what we're doing and help us to determine the best how for what we're doing. So look at those constraints and opportunities. Some restraints are, if you take our current situation, that you have to deliver without seeing the audience, that you can't conversationally assess their knowledge of the leader that you chose. You can't read the nonverbals on their faces and kind of see what their interest level is. You're not going to get any of that in this current situation that we have. And the audience has a wide variety of interests and career paths. So those are constraints. You have some opportunities, though, in this situation, too. The audience is full of people with big futures ahead of them, so hearing about successful people in any industry might be engaging. You have an opportunity to record and re-record your message. And third opportunity, that is probably only 3 in a list of many, is that you can rely on written responses. So if you want to do some audience analysis for your informative speech, you can rely on those written responses. You could even do a survey, and people are probably more likely to fill it out than they would have been in the classroom. So this is an example of how you can go through the constraints and opportunities before you set up your specific purpose, and it helps you get a little bit better idea of the context. So let's say if you were informing your audience about Misty Copeland. Misty Copeland is a young ballerina who's essentially the Horatio Alger of Black ballet. You would have to decide how to make her interesting to your audience, right? Interesting enough that you could keep their attention and hopefully convey some information that would be memorable. And you would in effect have to decide if you needed to make her interesting to get their attention and then inform them about her? Or should you inform them about her and then tell them why they should care, why she's interesting? When you're making these choices, you're preparing to make a strategy choice. And you make that based on your content, what you know about your audience, and your assessments of these constraints and opportunities. There's no magic formula for this, unfortunately. It's a choice you make based on your assessment of those things and the risks and benefits of each of your options. So the best thing to do is know what the strategies are. So here's a preview of our informative speech strategies that are outlined in our textbook. They are define, report, describe, explain, demonstrate, tell a story, and compare. So just a preview. And the thing to know as we go forward is that these strategies frequently overlap and are used simultaneously. So they, it's almost never just one or the other. So let's get started. Let's look at defining first. For our purposes, defining means to clarify a term or concept that's vague or troublesome. An example from a couple of years ago would have been net neutrality, something that wasn't really clear to a lot of people. But it can also mean introducing a new way of thinking or a new way to view a particular subject. You can think of it as sort of establishing a preferred way of thinking about a word. And one of the ideas that comes to my mind is footprint. We used to always think of footprints as, much more tangible and concrete, the footprints you leave on the ground, right? Or in the sand or mud, but now we have a carbon footprint. And so, when we were first trying to establish what that is, define would be a great strategy for helping people understand that. Not all definitions are neutral. Think about the phrase affirmative action and how that triggers a lot of different responses in different people, and a lot of different meanings in different people. And those meanings sometimes are negative in nature and sometimes have a positive connotation. And that's the kind of reason that you would want to use a define strategy. In this example, we're going to look at you can see where John Wooden, who is a very famous and successful athletic coach from a couple decades back, has defined the word success for himself and the people he coaches and teaches. Let's take a look at this great strategy he uses.
I coined my own definition of success in 1934 when I was teaching in high school in South Bend, Indiana, being a little bit disappointed and delusioned perhaps by the way parents of the youngsters in my English classes expected their youngsters to get an A or B. They thought a C was all right for the neighbor's children because the neighbor's children are all average. But they weren't satisfied with their own and would make the teacher feel that they had failed or the youngster had failed. And that's not right. The good Lord in his infinite wisdom didn't create us all equal as far as intelligence is concerned, any more than we equal for size, appearance. Not everybody could earn an A or B. I didn't like that way of judging it. And I did know how the alumni of various schools back in the 30s judged coaches and athletic teams. If you won them all, you were considered to be reasonably successful. Not completely, because I found out we had a number of years at UCLA where we didn't lose a game, but it seemed that we didn't win each individual game with the margin that some of our alumni had predicted, and quite frequently I really felt that they had backed up their predictions in a more materialistic manner. But I was still back in the 30s, so I understood that. But I didn't like it. I didn't agree with it. And I wanted to come up with something that I hoped would make me a better teacher and give the youngsters under my supervision, whether it be in athletics or in the English classroom, something to which to aspire other than just a higher mark in the classroom or more points in some athletic contest. And I thought about that for quite a spell, and I wanted to come up with my own definition. I thought that might help. And I knew how Mr. Webster defined it as the accumulation of material possessions or the attainment of position of power or prestige or something of that sort, worthy accomplishments perhaps, but in my opinion, not necessarily indicative of success. So I wanted to come up with something of my own. And I recalled I was raised on a small farm in southern Indiana, and Dad tried to teach me and my brothers that you should never try to be better than someone else. I'm sure at the time he did that. It didn't. Well, somewhere, I guess, in the hidden recesses of the mind, it popped out years later. Never try to be better than someone else. Always learn from others. And never cease trying to be the best you could be. That's under your control. And if you get too engrossed and involved and concerned in regard to things over which you have no control, it will adversely affect the things over which you have control. Then I ran across a simple verse that said, "At God's footstool to confess, a poor soul knelt and bowed his head. I failed," he cried. The Master said, "Thou didst thy best." That is success. From those things, and one other perhaps, I coined my own definition of success, which is peace of mind, attained only through self-satisfaction in knowing you made the effort to do the best of which you're capable. I believe that's true. If you make the effort to do the best of which you're capable, trying to improve the situation that exists for you, I think that's success, and I don't think others can judge that. I think it's like character and reputation. Your reputation is what you're perceived to be. Your character is what you really are.
So Wooden was experiencing the non-neutral definition of success based on the parents of his students, right? And he was getting tired of that. So he was like, I'm going to start by defining this for people. Here's my definition of success. And he told it to his parents and the parents of players and probably his other coaches on his staff eventually. He used it over and over again at the beginning of his speeches. He goes on in this speech to talk about more about the definition between success and winning. If you wanted to see that speech, it's pretty good. He has a lot of wisdom packed into this speech, and does a great job of using the strategy of defining as a starting point, especially as a starting point, but it's woven throughout the speech. All right, so that's the first strategy. Let's take a look at the next one. The second strategy is reporting. Reporting answers the question, what happened? If you use this strategy to inform, then you relate information with very little analysis or interpretation, and it's on purpose. That's why we call it reporting in the original definition of journalistic reporting. It's used primarily to provide new information or perspective on an issue, keeping in mind that it's impossible to be entirely objective because there's a bias in you as the speaker choosing what information to share with your audience. This is a great strategy when your topic needs to be broken down by parts. Here's an example of reporting from Hillary Clinton's speech on criminal justice reform given in 2015 at Columbia University. This is part of a policy speech, but she had to inform to set an agenda and hopefully eventually move people to action. That's what she was doing in this particular speech. This is the beginning of the description of a second area of focus she thought reform should include. It's a stark fact that the United States has less than 5% of the world's population, yet we have almost 25% of the world's total prison population. The numbers today are much higher than they were 30, 40 years ago, despite the fact that crime is at historic lows. So especially the first sentence there is definitely reporting. You might say that she starts getting into interpretation in the second sentence, and if I gave you the rest of the main point number 2 in the speech that she does, you would definitely hear interpretation. But she starts out there with reporting, okay? And that first sentence especially is fairly pure reporting. All right, so the first one was define, the second one is report, the third one is describe. This strategy strives to paint a mental picture for the audience, and the intention is that the audience will conjure up the same picture in their minds. And you get that picture through vivid details that you as the speaker provide. The strategy is very useful when listeners already share your perspective a little bit, and they can sort of fill in some of the pieces that they wouldn't be able to personally experience themselves using your description. It's a great strategy for trying to get people to sort of create a feeling, positive feeling about the topic. We're going to look at an example of this strategy from a speech by Elizabeth Warren at a keynote address at the Women's Law Center Anniversary Gala in 2017.
But by the end of the school year, I was pretty obviously pregnant. And the principal did what I think a lot of principals did back then. He wished me good luck, and he didn't ask me back for the next year and hired someone else for the job. And I stayed home, and I tried desperately to be a good wife and mother, but I really wanted to do something. So I came up with this plan to go back to school, and this time I found a law school that was nearby. Now, I cannot describe to you how crazy the idea was of my going to law school. My mother said many, many times, very loudly, that she thought I was jeopardizing my marriage. My brothers, all three of them, just thought I was plain nuts. And my then husband smiled indulgently, making it clear that he knew I could not possibly pull this off. But I bowed my head, I pushed on, you might say, nevertheless, I persisted. But I was determined. And so I took all the needed exams, I filled out the application, I budgeted and figured out how I could pay the $450 tuition. I worked out the commute in my trusty blue Volkswagen, and I had it all figured out, all of it, until I hit the one big boulder that nearly crushed me: childcare. My daughter Amelia was about to turn 2, and if I wanted to go to law school, I needed childcare. And I know it sounds like I wasn't very smart, but I hadn't really realized exactly how hard that was going to be. You know, I visited all kinds of places, I went everywhere, and I struck out everywhere. They cost a fortune, or they smelled funny, or the kids looked miserable. And this went on for weeks. And it's getting to be the end of the summer, and I'm starting to sweat. We were bearing down on the start of school, and I knew that if I couldn't get childcare worked out, my idea of going back to school was over before it started. And finally, less than 1 week before classes were starting, I found a place that seemed nice. Cheerful teachers, a good playground, smelled good. That thing matters, you know? There was only one problem. They only took children who were dependably potty trained. Man, I filled out that application. I said, sure, dependably potty trained. Got it. We are so on this.
Okay, so as it says in our slide, this is a great strategy when your audience already has some kind of overlap with your perspective. And this was the Women's Law Center. And, lots of women, probably many of them dealing with childcare. And so this was a terrific strategy for her to use because they could already identify. And it's a great example of a description. Our next strategy is explaining. We've looked at defining, reporting, and describing. The next strategy, this one is just exactly as you imagine it to be. We're talking about the consideration of different points of view on a given topic and the why of it, or speculation of the meaning. topics that might lend themselves to this are those that are frequently seen differently. Events, they kind of begin simple and then you expand to complex, or policies and processes where you can begin complex and then simplify it for people. Examples might include the Cuban Missile Crisis, impeachment hearings, Martha Stewart's approach to money management. Those are all things that people had different points of view on. What you're doing in this explaining strategy, again, is either starting broad and narrowing it down, or starting narrow and making it a more sort of open perspective or broad perspective for people. Demonstrating is up next. The beauty of this is that you guys have already done it so many times, right? With this strategy, the audience should be able to do what's been demonstrated by the end of the speech. And there are some things you want to consider when boiling things down to simple steps. So simple that the process becomes nebulous. You want to consider, do the listeners really need to see the process to understand it? Is the subject precise enough to demonstrate in the time available? Some of you probably ran into that challenge in your demonstration speech. Can you make the steps distinct and clear and get them in the right sequence? And making sure that your actions and your verbal are coordinated. Obviously, visual aids are huge and can really strengthen the demonstration strategy. Storytelling is the 6th of 7 strategies, so we're almost finished in your informative speeches. If you use this, then you're relating a narrative in a sequential fashion so that it fits together in a plot. This is really useful when creating a feeling about your topic, and that's kind of a big deal sometimes. It builds interest in the topic if the audience isn't familiar, so that's one of the benefits of this strategy. And it provides a structure and some organization to the speech. You can use it in all kinds of different ways, at the beginning, at the end, throughout the story, where you keep coming back to it and you use it as sort of the glue for your subject. We're not going to watch this speech because I want you to see the whole thing, but it is available when you download the PowerPoint, and it's from a TED Talk at the TEDx Women 2012 conference by a woman named Shabana Basij Rasik, and it's called Dare to Educate Afghan Girls. I really encourage you to watch it because it's only about 9 minutes, I think. So when you go to review this content or watch it again, be sure and check out her speech, and great example of storytelling at the beginning of her speech. The last of 7 strategies is comparing. And we don't mean comparing just as your English teachers have always told you, that comparing is showing similarities. In our version of comparison, we're talking about the similarities and the differences. You can use this to show a category of topic. So is a required freshman skills class an investment in fundamentals for a university, or is it redundant and wasteful? So that would be sort of a comparison example. It's a good strategy when you need to help the audience clarify their basis for making a choice. So here's our recap. We've covered 7 strategies: defining, reporting, describing, explaining, demonstrating, telling a story, and comparing. We talked a little bit about what makes each one of those particularly useful or powerful. So the third thing that we needed to talk about in this unit was how to help the audience retain the information that we're sharing with them, because what good is informing if we don't help them remember? So let's move to that section. All right, encouraging retention. Even the best speeches can be better recalled by the audience with the application of some specific techniques. So let's see how that works. I'm going to start by showing you the forgetting curve. And this forgetting curve points out that as time passes, we remember less. And generally, You might eventually forget it all, but you tend to remember a little bit, but you could remember more and make that curve not quite such a strong curve and a little bit more, ending higher over time if you use some of these strategies. And the first is attempt to gain and keep the audience's attention. This will help both with attention and retention. You can engage the listeners in active listening, challenge them to think about your topic, give them rhetorical questions, ask them to mentally role play situations. You can also use retrieval strategies where you're asking them to recall information you've already said earlier in the speech. It's sort of like an internal summary, except you pose it as a question and then you summarize it for them. You can also use reinforcement. This is a third way to encourage retention. It's your way of setting it up to reward their attention. You can do this in two ways. One is to use good organizational strategies and use those transitions and those recaps, internal summaries, internal previews. And another one you can use is to use the word we instead of you. We sets up a good immediacy feeling in the audience, a good rapport building feeling in the audience, and puts them at ease, which encourages retention. All right, that last strategy for encouraging retention is to use the style elements that are in chapter 12 of our textbook. You might not have gone over this content yet, but as you begin to look at the style elements that are things like alliteration and juxtaposition, those are things that help us remember and encourage the audience to do that and sort of flatten out that forgetting curve. All right, so those are all the strategies that we're going to cover right now to help the audience remember more of what you're saying and hopefully your speech have a bigger impact. All right, here's our wrap up. Informative speech strategies don't intend to influence, but they may actually do that thing. Informative strategies provide new information or perspective. They function to set agendas and can create positive and negative feelings. Any combination of our informative strategies can be used, and they might even overlap. And you want to make sure that you use effective strategies to encourage retention in the audience. Thanks so much for your time. I know that learning online is not as interesting sometimes as learning in the classroom, although you might be more comfortable in your chair. Hat tip briefly for some of this information coming from Zarefsky and Engels textbook and Miss Ann O'Neill. Thank you very much.
Better.